Starling.
Order, order. Will John Penrose to move the motion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Efford. Good to have you looking after us and making sure we don't misbehave during the course of this debate.
Certainly will.
Good to see you there. And I beg to move the motion which stands in my name. Mr. Efford, just over a year ago, I was commissioned to write a report by the Treasury and by the Department of Bays, and it came out almost exactly a year ago. And it's called Power to the People, and here it is, and it's about competition policy. It was at the request of the government. And so I thought it was reasonably sensible, a year after publication, that we might want to have a look at what's happened as a result of the recommendations that I made, which ones have happened, which ones haven't, and hope to perhaps goad, tease, or otherwise persuade my honourable friend the Minister to be as indiscreet as he possibly can about what might be going to happen in future to fill in any gaps about the recommendations which have not yet taken place. So what I want to do very briefly, if I can, is to summarise what the progress has been in the intervening year to implement some of the recommendations in this report, but also to focus, I hope, fairly straightforwardly on the things that haven't happened yet, so that the Minister has a text from which to work, if I can put it that way, and the gaps which still remain. And to be fair, Mr. Efford, it is true to say that there has been a reasonable amount of progress. Well, I don't want to overclaim on this. There has been a reasonable amount of progress across government on some of the recommendations which I was putting forward in here. For example, there have been a series of consultations and commitments from the Competition and Markets Authority about the kinds of changes that they want to make to their internal processes and the way they work. One of the central recommendations in this report is that the CMA both need stronger consumer powers in order that they should be upgraded to match their antitrust competition powers, and that there's a whole series of other things they need to do to move faster to get to judgments on individual cases much more quickly. Ideally, in most cases, in the easier cases, within days or months, rather than in current parlance when things can easily run into years. So faster, more certain decisions, but also the CMA is supposed to upgrade its capability to become what I've termed the microeconomic sister to the Bank of England's macroeconomic work. So in other words, every time the Bank of England talks about the macroeconomy, the CMA should have a public role in putting forward our progress in creating supply-side reforms to improve competition in individual markets and in individual parts of the country, because, as we all know, our country has a real problem with declining levels of productivity and declining levels of competitiveness the further away from the M25 you travel. So there's a series of recommendations in there, and some of them, as I said, particularly there have been a series of consultations on internal reforms to the CMA. Those are very, very welcome, and there are things like the microeconomic sibling to the Bank of England that I just mentioned. That has been declared and is something which is due to be set up. There's also declarations that they're going to be upgrading their consumer powers in due course. We will need primary legislation for that. There's been extensive consultation on it, and also for things like stronger penalties for companies that don't comply with data requests and so forth, who seek to slow down the progress of any kind of competition cases. So all good news in that area, at least, or mostly good news in that area. They also have established something called the DMU, the Digital Markets Unit. That is going to be absolutely essential for the future operation of making sure that we can deal with consumer detriment being created by digital network monopolies. That's the big fangs, as they're called, the people like Google and Facebook. That is now in operation, but in shadow form. It doesn't have any of the necessary legislative powers that it's going to have, but it's at least started. And there's been an increase in their resources post-Brexit because, of course, as we left the EU, that meant that we had to have a stronger domestic pro-competition set of institutions. Otherwise, all the things that had been happening in Brussels in the EU's competition world would just have not been able to be coped with, and they were repatriated over here. Equally, in the chapter on economic regulators, the ideas in here say that we should be trying to reduce the overall role of economic regulators over time, but we should be trying to normalise as much of the markets which they run as possible. There is no intrinsic reason why, for example, energy or telecoms or others can't be mostly normal and as usual and as run-of-the-mill as you and I, Mr. Efford, going off to buy a loaf of bread or a pint of milk. We don't need an economic regulator to protect us when we go and do that. And there's large chunks of these markets where we could be just as protected by normal consumer protection laws, and we wouldn't need an economic regulator, except for the bits of those markets which are fundamentally based around network monopolies. And every single one of the economically regulated sectors in our economy, be it telecoms, be it energy, be it water, be it any of the others, they all have network monopolies at their core, be it electricity distribution, the national grid and so forth, or even local electricity distribution grids, or gas pipes or water pipes or whatever it might be. There's a network monopoly at the core. Those are inherently less competitive. You can't get them to work in the normal way. You do have to have a residual level of economic regulation on those networks, and perhaps there's some deeply embedded and hard to solve consumer detriments in things like finance too. But other than that, Mr. Efford, we could and we should be seeking to erode the role of the economic regulators over time, normalising their markets as far as we can over time, and that's what this report recommends. It's not a quick process, it will take time, but it can and it should be done outside the areas I've just described. So how are we doing? Well, in some respects, quite well. There's a thing called, and I'm sure that everybody here has been absolutely keeping it next to their beds as bedtime reading, there's a thing called the Economic Regulation Policy Paper, which came out from the Bayes Department a couple of weeks ago, and it indeed says that it wants to address the statutory duties of the economic regulators, and it wants to increase the level of competition which they are involved with, and it makes all the right noises and speaks all the right warm words about doing this. I'll come back to it in a minute, though, Mr. Efford, because one of the problems with it is that the progress towards it says that they are going in modernising the statutory duties, which will do the process that I've just been laying out. It says it's going to launch a review of utilities regulatory statutory duties in 2022, but it doesn't say when it's going to be launched, it doesn't say when it's going to finish, it doesn't say what they're going to do about it when it's done. And everybody here, I'm sure, is very, very familiar with the term long grass, and I'm hoping that the Minister will be able to reassure me and everybody else here that this isn't long grass, this is going to happen in a timely way, and that this is, indeed, he's out with his lawnmower trimming the sward in order to make sure that it actually is going to happen, rather than just get parked somewhere and gently forgotten about. There's also good news on public procurement. This is something which has been brought into sharp focus during the pandemic. We absolutely need to have a faster public procurement process, a better, more transparent public procurement process. This is something which we inherited as a process from the EU. It's something called the OJU rules. And they do an awful lot of good things, but they do them incredibly slowly. They do them in incredibly bureaucratic fashion, Mr. Everett. And as a result, what happens, therefore, is that we end up with processes which are clunky, and when we have a national emergency or an international emergency like the pandemic, they are cruelly exposed as being things which don't work nearly well enough. And I'm pleased to say that there was, when I published this, and there remains a continuing commitment to launching a new public procurement bill, which I think is due, probably not in this session, but I hope in the next session. It's certainly been heavily trailed, and I'm hoping and expecting that that will basically take what we already have and make it much more nimble, much more digital, much more open to small firms being able to compete with long-standing large incumbents, people like Carillion, and therefore will be not only pro-competitive but also involve a great deal better value for money for taxpayers, and will mean that we are less likely to have, for example, a scramble for PPE or something like it if we ever have another national emergency like the pandemic in future. And finally, Mr. Efford, on the positive side of the ledger, there's been some progress on the ideas I was talking about for trying to improve competition outside the southeast and to improve retail reactions or retail opportunities for people who need to get redress if they've been done wrong, if their consumer rights have been breached. What that means, Mr. Efford, is that there's been a little bit of progress on trying to make things like small claims courts and ombudsmen work better, work more digitally, work faster, and continue to be cheap, so that there is sort of ready justice, if necessary, for somebody who hasn't got what they paid for when it comes to consumer rights. That's all good, but we have a great deal further to travel, because my contention is, in a digital world, we should be able to have the same kind of 24/7 service that we currently expect if we log on to do our grocery shopping at 3 a.m. in the morning. I don't, but some people do, and it is something which we increasingly expect to be able to do. If you can do the shopping 24/7, you should be able to do the redress 24/7 if you need to, and there is a noticeable gap, although it is starting to close. There has been progress in this area on things like reforms of the small claims courts and so forth. But there hasn't been reforms of some of the other things that need to happen, such as county competition courts, which is what's necessary to create an opportunity for local small companies that are being ganged up on by larger local incumbents from being able to prosecute their competition rights, to take someone to court for a breach of competition law at a scale which is never going to be affordable if they have to take it to the Competition Appeals Tribunal here in London, even under the fast-track approval process which they currently run. It's still going to be out of the reach of most small regional firms. If you are a restaurant in Bristol, an estate agent in Hull, or a hotelier in Liverpool, you won't be able to afford to do anything if you're being ganged up on by a local competitor until we get what I'm calling county competition courts, and I'm afraid there's very little progress towards that at the moment, nor is there progress towards the kind of generalised update and improvement of the local trading standards teams, which is needed in many, many parts of the country in order to make sure that there are proper defenders of consumer rights. But without wanting to cavil too much about that, that's a decent list of progress, Mr. Everett. It would be churlish to say that there's been nothing happening in the last year. There really has, and that's a decent list, and I would commend the government and in its personal representative and my friend the Minister for what's happened. But I'm afraid there is a slightly longer list, certainly a serious list, of things on the other side of the ledger that has not yet happened. Let me quickly run through them, and then I will leave other people to pick up on any points they want to. The first point is that one of the central points here is about speeding up the CMA process, speeding up how fast you can get justice through the CMA, through the Competition and Markets Authority, if you need to. I mentioned right at the start, Mr. Efford, that one of the things we have to do is to make sure that you can get a case decided in the CMA for everything but the most complicated, the most hideously difficult and groundbreaking cases. Most of them ought to take weeks or months rather than years, and there isn't at the moment an overall process redesign going on within the CMA and the Competition Appeals Tribunal, which is the appeals court effectively for lots of the CMA. There isn't the kind of core process redesign, if you want to call it that, that will be necessary in order to make that kind of dramatic improvement in the availability of justice and in the certainty of justice that will be needed to deliver that. And it matters, Mr. Efford, because at the moment it is all too easy for large incumbents, well-lawyered incumbents, to walk backwards slowly in the face of a challenge from a small and plucky entrepreneurial insurgent firm that's trying to transform and disrupt a particular market. And if they can strew legal obstacles in the challenger's way, in the challenger's path, they can basically make it much, much harder for Britain's economy to be nimble, to move quickly, and happily give way.
Thank you, my friend, for giving way. I appreciate what he's saying about competition. Does this apply to local authorities where they tend to just employ one arm's-length contractor when actually there are plenty of other people who live locally who could potentially tender for those jobs such as road building and maintenance, etc.?
That's a particularly good example of the kind of problem which I was referring to when I was mentioning the public procurement reforms. Those reforms, when they come, and I think we should all be extremely interested to see what they show, should mean that not just local government, but also national government and indeed many arm's-length bodies from the NHS through to British English Heritage and everyone else in between should be able to make decisions much faster, but also in a way which is much more accessible to small firms that are not the big incumbents and aren't equipped to wade through pages and pages and pages of tender documents, some of which you require PhD in before you can act, and I've got little to do with actually whether or not your product or your service is better than the big incumbents. So absolutely that will be an essential change, I think. So speeding up the CMA, absolutely essential. The bit which is one of the most glaring and, I'm afraid, saddest omissions from the recommendations in this is on better regulation. Now, Mr. Efford, there's a difference between deregulation and better regulation. I'm sure you're all thoroughly familiar with it. But for the record for everybody else, deregulation is where you are getting rid of standards and it's a sort of race to the bottom. That is not what I'm recommending in this report at all. Better regulation is saying how do we deliver the same standards in environmental quality, in food standards, in workers' rights, in all the other things that we regard as essential in our modern society. How do we deliver those same standards in a way which is cheaper and quicker and simpler or more digital or more modern? How can we do that in a way which costs the providers of those things less? And if it costs the providers less, then that means they can do it at lower cost, and that means that you and I as consumers may therefore get the same product or service at a lower price in the first place as well. So it's up to everybody, it's to all our benefits if we can do that. And getting rid of red tape and regulations is one of the hardest things in Westminster and Whitehall to achieve, Mr. Efford, because everybody here knows that the culture of this place is framed in terms of making new rules. That is how, if you are a civil servant, or indeed, dare I say it, one or two MPs, that's how you make your career, is by inventing new rules, not getting rid of old ones. And that's the culture of this place. So it's an extremely easy thing to say, an extremely difficult thing to do, and there have been examples, rare ones, Mr. Efford, in the past where we have succeeded. There was a brief flowering of success under David Cameron when he was Prime Minister between 2010 and 2015, where the pro-regulatory ratchet got reversed. And for a couple of years, we were genuinely making progress. And in fact, local firms and small firms, particularly the FSB and people like them, noticed it and said, this is working. Unfortunately, when he left, the blob pounced. I don't know if a blob can pounce, Mr. Efford, but the machine that loves making yes, the blob enveloped the new regime. And when David Cameron left, the stuff that worked, which is basically have a gateway condition saying you can't, if you're the Minister for Paperclips, have new rules about paperclips until you found 2 old ones to get rid of. That's the thing that had been making it work up until then. The blob said, that's a terribly old-fashioned way of doing it. We've got a much better way of doing it. Why don't we have a big target and we'll hit the target and that will be good. But because it had got rid of all the rigour, all the mechanism for getting rid of the red tape, what happened instead was there was a huge target which was completely missed. In 2 years, we went backwards. We went backwards by £8 billion worth of extra costs, when we've been expecting to increase, to remove £9 billion. So instead of removing £9 billion, we added 8. It's a £17 billion miss in 2 years. Absolutely disastrous compared to what we've been doing for the previous 5 years. And the thing that worries me is that this recommends that we go back to something rather similar. I don't care if it's 1 in, 1 out, or 1 in, 2 out, but it is essential that you have that gateway condition, because if you ain't got it, we will carry on going backwards. And yet, I'm afraid, Mr. Efford, I'm afraid and very sorry to report that the benefits of Brexit document, again, another piece of bedtime reading, which I'm sure you've gone through in detail, on page 27, says in terms that we're not going to reintroduce the old system at all. We're going to stick with the one that's just failed, and we're going to carry on repeating the same mistake that we did before. And I'm really, really hoping that my friend the Minister will be able to tell me that that's now changed around, but I fear that he won't be able to. And if we don't, then we will fail again. And let's be very, very clear that that's what we're currently headed to do. Final thoughts on the economic regulators, Mr. Efford. I'm nearly there. The economic regulators, as I say, we have got some progress here because I mentioned before that the government has said it's consulting on trying to improve the statutory duties to add extra competition, which should lead to shrinking the regulators over time. However, as I mentioned before, we don't have a date when this report's due, so we don't know if they're ever going to actually do anything about it. I hope that my honourable friend will be able to tell us about that. But without a date and without a firm commitment that the report is going to be genuinely trying to normalise as much of the market as it can, outside the network monopolies that I was talking about before, without that firm commitment in principle, then the suspicion has to be, Mr. Efford, that in fact we aren't trying to normalise these markets, and what really is supposed to be happening, or what is going to happen, unacknowledged but nonetheless firmly, there is a suspicion that there is no appetite for normalising as much of these markets as we can, and that in fact the preferred destination is perpetual heavy regulation instead. And I'm really hoping that the Minister will be able to reassure me that that is not the de facto intention behind what we're currently doing. Final point, Mr. Efford, is the final chapter in this report. The final chapter of the report is about subsidy control. And subsidies are a very heady political drug, which if we're not really, really careful, then everybody, doesn't matter which political party they belong to, it's always tempting when the lobbyists come knocking. Doesn't matter if you're in opposition or in government, doesn't matter if it's local government or national government or subnational government, doesn't matter what it is. When the lobbyists come knocking to say it's terrible that this big important local employer, which has got left behind and hasn't invested in whatever it was doing and is now 20 years out of date and is being overtaken by plucky upstart entrepreneurial upstarts from other parts of the country or indeed other countries. Isn't it terrible that these jobs are now at risk and what we need is just a temporary little wafer-thin subsidy, please, in order to tide us through for a couple of years while we fix things. And of course they don't fix things, then a couple of years later they come back and they ask for more. And that is both expensive for taxpayers, it reduces the productivity of British industry, it reduces the long-term security and sustainability of British jobs, because ultimately they become progressively more and more vulnerable to international competition, and it is ultimately the thing that did for us in the 1960s and 70s, and which we had enormous pain in trying to fix in the 1980s and 90s. So subsidy control is vital, Mr. Efford, and it's one of those rules that's just come back post-Brexit from being run by Brussels. And we have a subsidy control bill that's currently in Parliament at the moment. It's down at the other end in the Lords. And it does all sorts of really good things to speed up our subsidy control process. It's much more nimble, it's much more light touch. It says that if you are compliant with the, is it 6 or 7 different principles? 7 different principles, thank you very much, of good subsidy as opposed to bad subsidy, then you can just get on with it, whether or not you're a local council or national government minister or anybody in between. Which is fine, except that we're keeping them a secret, Mr. Efford. We're not telling anybody what the subsidies are that we're dishing out. The EU system, which is what we're trying to replace, said that you had to disclose any subsidies that you made above €500,000, which is quite a high level, actually. That means that quite a lot of subsidies never get disclosed at all, particularly if they're dished out by local councils. But now we're going to say you don't have to declare anything unless it's over £500,000. And last time I looked at the euro-pound exchange rate, that's a higher level of disclosure than the old EU system. There are some other levels, which I'm sure the Minister will remind us about, which are a bit lower than that for other bits and pieces of it. But broadly speaking, we're going to be declaring less in future. We are less transparent in future than we were in the past. And that, Mr. Efford, leaves the door open to cronyism. It leaves the door open for local authorities or national governments to dish out money to their mates, secure in the knowledge that nobody will know because we won't be able to see. And it also means that it leaves the door open to larger levels of subsidisation, potentially of less competitive firms, and therefore wasting taxpayers' money in future. And given what's happening to the cost of living at the moment, none of us want to waste a single penny of hard-won taxpayers' money, particularly when we have to take it as taxes in the first place. So, Mr. Efford, a curate's egg. It's sort of 2 cheers rather than 3 for what's been done so far. After a year, there is genuine progress, and I'm delighted to celebrate those bits which I started off on the positive side of the ledger. But there's quite a lot, marginally more on the negative side of the ledger, which has not yet happened and which could. The advantage of it, Mr. Efford, is that most of the reforms that I've gone through which have not yet happened and which could won't cost the Treasury a bean. They won't cost the taxpayer a bean. They will actually mean that the British jobs and British companies will become more competitive and more sustainable and safer in the long term, because ultimately the only thing that protects us against international competition is the fact that we are better than the international firms we're competing against. And so this is a cheap way of a route to economic success. So I'm hoping, Mr. Efford, that therefore it's a bit of a no-brainer. It's one of these things that you say, well, why wouldn't you do all this stuff? Why on earth would you not? And the only reason, I'm sure, is that there are genuinely significant vested interests behind some of these things which make them difficult to shift. But I'm sure that we have a doughty warrior in the shape of the government minister who's going to be responding to this. And I'm looking forward, therefore, to hearing how quickly he's going to be able to fight and smite the various different vested interests that would otherwise slow us down.
The question is that the House has considered UK competition and consumer policy in response to the Penrose Review. Yvonne Favage.
Thank you, Mr Efford. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and can I congratulate the Honourable Member for Westminster Supermayor both on securing the debate and on the review. Now, given his doughty defence of non-regulation, I hesitate to propose more regulation, but what I would like to see is actually a new competition and consumer bill in the next session of Parliament. It's never been more needed than now, given the effect of the 2-year pandemic and the cost of living crisis. I mean, the pandemic has led to more people buying online, and more people are putting in fake reviews, which is a scam. It's left millions of consumers bruised, out of pocket, and with little trust into the companies trying to sell them goods and services. More than 7 in 10 consumers use online reviews to inform purchases. They don't go down the pub and talk to the neighbours. They haven't been able to for 2 years, pretty much. They use online reviews. There's been review practices across many of the largest online platforms, Amazon and Google, there's Facebook, and multiple sectors. There's been a thriving market in commissioning and selling fake reviews, and which have called for this to be commissioning and incentivising a fake review to be added to the list of automatically unfair practices, Schedule 1 of the CPRs. And I support this. Where else do people get information from than looking at a review? And what they need is the confidence that this review is a verified purchase, it's been written by an actual individual who wasn't given any money or incentive to buy it, hasn't been given a free parcel delivered to the doorstep unknowingly, and that actually they are honest about the review. And we also see practices where reviews are taken offline. If they're a negative review, people are being told, oh, well, we'll pay you £5 for a positive review, and if it's not positive enough, they don't get the money. There's also other exploitative online practices, subscription traps, drip pricing, and it's not about choosing the interests of the consumer over the interests of businesses, because the more effective that consumer protection becomes, the more the UK economy benefits. It's win-win. If consumers can trust businesses and the practices, the more inclined they are to buy their products. And crucially to the businesses, they then come back for more. And particularly when people are thinking very carefully about how to spend their money, it's imperative that we encourage trust in businesses. The companies will then compete on their ability to meet customers' needs and provide real value, rather than on cutting corners or passing off shoddy products. Only the best businesses will then survive, and that's the way it should be. It's a partnership. The consumer and the businesses both have the same interest at heart. The consumers want the best products at the best prices. The businesses want to sell them those as well. And an important component of the legislation is around redress and ADR. Now, which says there should be mandatory dispute resolution schemes in key sectors that have a high volume of complaints and where it's often complex and high value. I think we've all seen, particularly through the pandemic, air travel and the problems people had in getting refunds. Thousands of COVID-related flight cancellations left people out of pocket, and their airlines quite often chose to ignore the law by refusing a refund. People waited months, if not years, for those refunds. Now, there are 2 ADR schemes in the aviation industry, but neither is compulsory to join. Ryanair left one scheme because they disagreed with the judgments relating to strikes by their airqueue. Jet Air, Emirates and other airlines have failed to join any ADR scheme. If things go wrong, the passengers don't have any redress. Now, in early 2019, the Consumer Protection APPG, which I chair, did publish a report calling for the wholesale reform of the alternative dispute resolution platform. We looked in detail at the various ombudsmen and the ADR schemes, and we found enormous variation in how they operate. Now, some are statutory bodies, some are not. Some cover all the firms in the sector because everyone has to join them, some don't. Some can enforce the judgments, some can't. And it's total confusion for the consumer, often left frustrated, they don't know who to go to. And air travel, and that was one of the areas, again, where the statutory scheme was most keenly felt. And that was pre-COVID. Our report said it needed a powerful and accessible statutory ombudsman, and it probably echoes really the call from the Honourable Member from Westminster on a 24/7 dispute resolution platform. People don't know where to go. They've got to negotiate this really difficult maze of ombudsmen. Who do they go to? There should be a single point of entry for all complaints, and they should then be passed through to the correct ombudsman. I mean, I personally think there should be an ombudsman for travel, so that people don't think, well, actually, some of my journey was booked on air travel, but had a bit of rail and was it the railway's delay that led to me losing the plane, or was it the fact that the plane didn't? It just gets far too confusing for the consumer. So we really need to make sure that people often buy a package that include the flights and hotels. Well, is that a package, or is it a separate booking for the flight and the hotel? And some companies actually have said in the past, well, you book the flight with us, you book the hotel with us, but it's not a package. You book them separately. When one part goes wrong, who do they turn to? And that's why we do need an ombudsman for the whole of the travel industry that can deal with the appropriately. And I think that's the model that they've got in Germany. And I also think we need to look at enforcement. The CMA is responsible for the enforcement of consumer law in precedent-setting and market-wide cases, but it lacks the power to effectively protect consumer rights and deter companies. In order to enforce a decision, there's a lengthy court process, and it's only if the company fails to comply with the court order. And I think one of the examples of this is the issue with Viagogo, the ticket sellers. It took 6 years for Viagogo to actually be forced to change their practices and follow the CMA guidance on the information it gives to consumers. But in Canada, the secondary ticketing site Ticketmaster and StubHub had immediate fines of $4 million Canadian dollars and $5 million Canadian dollars in costs. And then they got also a fine with $1.3 million for not complying with the previous warning. Now, compare that to taking 6 years where this company can, frankly, rip off consumers. It's just not good enough. There's other examples of companies in travel and wedding sectors that, despite clear guidance from the CMA, were very slow to offer refunds, unlawfully held on to customers' money, months and months after the cancellation of services. And that's a cancellation by them, not by the consumer, by the way. So we need a simplified process of investigation. We need the CMA to have greater powers to raise standards and to challenge companies that fail to comply, along the lines of those enjoyed by the other UK regulators. For example, the Financial Conduct Authority and the Information Commissioner's Office. We do have the power to do this, but it needs some teeth. It's no use having regulation, legislation, unless it can be enforced. And it needs to be enforced easily by the consumer, because quite often they can be deterred by long, complex process. And some businesses rely on that, actually. We're all consumers. Most of the time, things do go smoothly. But it's when things go wrong that the gaps in protection are exposed. And limiting this exposure is absolutely vital to give consumers the confidence to make more purchases without the undue stress and the worry that many have had to go through in the past.
Thank you, Mr. Eppard, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Weston-super-Mare, on securing this crucial debate and for his excellent work, not only on his review, but as the UK's anti-corruption champion. My honourable friend's review is a vital piece of work in reviewing on how our competition policy can drive enterprise, productivity and growth. And I'm pleased to recognise that the more competition and support for small businesses outside the South East is key to our levelling up agenda. I speak as a member for Truro and Falmouth in Cornwall, which has an economy built on fantastic small businesses, with 3/4 of local companies employing fewer than 5 people. While the terms competition law and competition policy might seem very removed from our everyday lives, it can be argued that failing to create a better regulatory regime that fully supports small businesses, consumers and fair competition has actually led to higher prices and lower wages in Cornwall for much of the last decade. We must unpick the fact that Cornwall has the lowest productivity levels anywhere in the UK, which places the region at the heart of the government's levelling up agenda. And I draw the House's attention to section 6 of the report, which shows that Britain has a well-known productivity problem, especially outside the southeast. Our geographical skew in productivity isn't normal, with only 2 other European countries, Poland and Romania, having bigger variations than ours. This difference translates to everyone's wages. In Cornwall, 1 in 3 workers earns below the national living wage, and much of the employment in Cornwall is reliant on a few low-paying industry groups, namely hospitality and retail. And these are sources of pride for Cornwall and its flourishing tourism sector, but it's inescapable that both are both sources of low pay and low productivity. Against a backdrop of rapid change in the world of work and the need to increase productivity, action and to improve skills in Cornwall is crucial. Investing in skills will attract more competitive and successful firms, creating a virtuous circle that attracts more high-skilled people to live and work in the area, boosting productivity, jobs and wages even further. I'm currently in talks with BEIS and other government officials about the lithium that's under our feet in Cornwall. And we're very lucky geologically that we have this there, and I think few people will realise that actually there's enough lithium under the Cornish soil to power at least half of the electric vehicles that we need in the future. But Cornwall's very good at getting things out of the ground and sending them away. What we actually need to do is make sure that all of the processing to get it to a battery-ready status also happens in the county, creating long-term jobs. But to do that, we're competing with firms in China and other overseas players, and that makes it very difficult, and that's why we need to work with government to make sure that that happens locally. I'm pleased with recent progress, such as the news that the excellent team at Truro and Penrith College have applied to the Skills Accelerator programme, ushering in a new approach that ensures that all technical education and training is based on what employers actually need. This is yet another example of our principal, Martin Tucker, and his brilliant team at Truro and Penrith, leading the way with excellence and innovation in the learning and skills sector. This adds to their strong existing offer, including free skills boot camps in digital and technical careers and the high-level skills project to support individuals looking to enhance their knowledge and develop their careers. We must consider all the options on the table to increase the region's productivity. The report makes several crucial recommendations to reform competition policy and to put consumers at the heart of markets, which I would urge the government to consider. In particular, the report notes that to raise productivity in areas such as Cornwall, we need to boost the local competitive temperature by supporting small businesses to compete with large competitors, which is what I was driving at with my earlier intervention. I want to highlight 2 areas of the report, which are reducing the burden of red tape and supporting digital industries. Laws and regulations are a crucial part of our market economy, as we've already said, and they protect staff, consumers and the environment. And I've been very local, particularly about the need for strong regulations on water companies, which are currently responsible for much of the pollution in our rivers, including the River Fowl in my constituency. And I agree that the review that actually we need better regulation, which maintains standards but applies them in the least costly and the most unbureaucratic way possible. In particular, we must address the growing crisis in the fishing sector due to complicated new export rules and the lack of clarity about fishing quotas and an increase in red tape. And at this point, I have to declare an interest as being a fishwife. This is something I hear at the breakfast table daily. We must, changes have to be significantly, that have hit our shellfish producers in particular. And some businesses face the real possibility of collapse unless we take urgent action to help. The fishing industry plays a vital role in the Cornish economy, and I urge the government to step in and address the issues to secure its long-term future. But more than that, we have a lot of small producers in Cornwall, and the only place really, up until very recently, has been to take their catch to market. Now, I know a couple of years ago that if you got £1.50 for a kilo of mackerel at market, you could go into the supermarkets the same day and see a lesser quality, so a net caught, one that's been in a net for a couple of days and isn't as fresh as your line caught one. And the consumer will be paying something like £10 or £12 a kilo for the same type of fish. Now, somebody's making an awful lot of money out of that fish, and it is not the food producer, it is not the fisherman. So I'm pleased that the government has been encouraging direct sales, but I would encourage them even further to reduce the red tape that these boys are having to and girls are having to put themselves through to ensure that they can sell direct to farm shops, and even, if we could encourage it, direct to supermarkets. I encourage the report's proposals for a new pro-competition regime for digital markets. Digital technologies bring us many benefits, transforming our economy, society and daily lives. However, there are downsides caused by firms with enormous network and digital data monopolies, so we must ensure digital regulation promotes competition and innovation. Digital industries are a growing part of the economy in Cornwall, with a rapidly expanding digital and creative community that's grown by 76% since 2010. And I will do all I can to support the government to ensure that we build a pro-growth data regime that will allow the digital industry in Cornwall to thrive. Improving productivity in areas such as Cornwall is key to levelling up in the UK, which is why it's important that we invest in skills and reform to make better regulation in industries such as fishing and all the way to digital markets. I look forward to supporting the government as they consider the recommendations of the report, and I'll continue to champion all our small businesses, innovation and competition now and in the years to come.
Amy Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Eckford. Pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Weston-super-Mare, on his report and on securing the debate this afternoon as well, which is a very important debate. And I particularly wanted to address his comments on the Digital Markets Unit, which he says has been set up in shadow form. And I think we hopefully will see, we eagerly anticipate the Queen's speech to see whether there's legislation in the next session to give the unit the power that it needs, because so much of our commerce, so much consumer interaction takes place through digital services. We've seen that more than ever during the pandemic, but they are an integral part of the economy. And it's right that we question and challenge whether these digital markets are truly competitive and whether the very large players that dominate them are guilty of abusive market power given the great positions that they hold. It's tempting to think, well, there are lots of big digital companies, therefore, presumably they all compete against each other, and therefore that creates a fair market. But when you break that market down, what you see is a series of monopolies that exist within each of those sectors. So unsurprisingly, Google is 92% of the search business in the world. Chrome, which is owned by Google, has 62% of the browser market. Facebook and Google together control about 70% of the digital display advertising market worldwide. If you have a mobile phone, it runs on one of two operating systems. 70% of them run on the Android operating system, which is owned by Google, 30% on iOS, which is owned by Apple. And you might think, well, at least there's a market split there. But of course, in both cases, they are monopolies. If you are an Apple customer, as I have my iPhone here, I have no choice but to purchase things, purchase apps through App Store. There's no interoperable alternative system. I can't use a different App Store system. I can't use the Google App Store to download apps onto an Apple product any more than I could the other way around. So even that you have a market that is central to the world economy, mobile communications devices, that is dominated by only two operating systems, both of which are monopolies for their users. For the messaging app market, in the UK, WhatsApp has 75% market penetration. The next most popular is Facebook Messenger, which has nearly 60% market penetration. That is, people using it. Of course, people have multiple messaging apps. And both those two are owned by the same company. So we see across the digital markets these relative monopolies. Now, is there evidence of abuse of market power? There's certainly evidence of these companies treating customers differently. There's evidence that Apple has different charging policies for different companies to sell through App Store. It doesn't charge everyone the same amount. We've seen cases where Facebook is allowing different businesses to acquire different levels of Facebook data to help drive their businesses through the Facebook systems, depending on the value of the commercial relationship to the company. When I chaired the Digital Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, we published evidence that we secured from an American app developer, which showed that Facebook sometimes made arbitrary determinations about whether an app developer should be able to have access to the Facebook graph at all, depending on whether they thought the product they were developing was a threat to their business. Some people may remember in the dim and distant past the short film app called Vine, which was very popular. People uploaded these very short films to Vine. Facebook decided, Mark Zuckerberg personally decided, that Vine was acquiring too much Facebook data through that app, so they kicked it off the platform. There was an email that was published where Mark Zuckerberg was asked to confirm whether he wanted to do this, and he replied saying, yep, go for it. I remember in the report, in response to that, the the creators of Vine said they remember that moment as if it was yesterday because it was the moment that effectively killed their business. The chief exec of a global tech company can sit like the Emperor Augustus and put his thumb up or down and determine whether a business is allowed to succeed or not based on his own assessment as to whether that business is a competitor to his or not. And we often say, why is it in the tech sector in particular, the UK produces brilliant, thriving companies, but they don't get a scale? Well, one of the reasons they don't get a scale is that if they are too successful, they are squeezed out of a market. They are squeezed out by bigger, dominant players that will either deny them fair access to their customers through their platform or acquire them or give them the option of being acquired or just driven out of business altogether. There have been investigations, competition investigations, looking at preferential ranking on systems like Apple and Google as to whether Google favours in search results businesses with which it has a commercial relationship to the detriment of others who it sees as a competitor. Amazon has the ability to monitor whether a product is successful, who's buying it, if it's too successful, whether it should copy it to launch its own product. Amazon doesn't give customer data, purchase data to businesses that sell through Amazon to other people. Amazon is both the creator of the infrastructure through which businesses sell to their customers, as well as selling its own products alongside them, giving them immense market power. So I think it is right that we need a digital markets unit that can ensure not only that consumers are treated fairly, that consumers have fair pricing and there's fair competition amongst products, but also businesses that reach their customers through other tech platforms are treated fairly as well. There's a fair rate that they pay if they're paying for advertising. There's a fair access to data that's comparative to what other businesses get, and they are not a victim of prejudice, of aggressive pricing against them on behalf of the platform or pure prejudice in deranking and downgrading them. All of these are central to the working of the digital economy today, and that's why it's so important that we have the Digital Markets Unit with the ability to launch these investigations for evidence of abuse of market power by the tech platforms towards other businesses and to the detriment of the consumer interest as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm delighted to participate in this debate on UK competition and consumer policy in response to the Penrose review, and I pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Weston-super-Mare for all the work that he has invested as part of this review. And the goals of the Penrose review to improve consumer choices and outcomes, of course, are very important and something we can all sign up to. Now more than ever, with household budgets so badly squeezed during the cost of living crisis, consumers must be supported to secure the best value for money and have sufficient protection under the law. For that to happen, we need UK competition and consumer protection that is fit for the modern age. Consumers need to have confidence that should they fall victim to exploitation and unscrupulous practices, they have recourse to redress and that they have the consumer protection they need and deserve. And it's clear that some markets currently and simply do not work for the consumer. And I understand the clear statement of intent in the Penrose review was that the aspiration must be to ensure that markets work for people, not the other way around. Who could argue with that? Consumer confidence is essential for economic growth, so it's worrying that research by Consumer Champion Which has found that up to 1/3 of customers experience at least one problem with a product or service every year. As well as the financial loss and anxiety that goes along with this, it has a detrimental impact on consumer confidence. We all know that there are gaps in consumer protection and enforcement, some of which have been exacerbated by the pandemic. For example, we all witnessed how the disruption to the travel industry during COVID left passengers out of pocket when their airlines either refused to pay or delayed paying refunds for cancelled flights in good time. We know that the digital markets are not subject to the same regulations as their online counterparts, opening the door to fake product reviews, which have exploded onto online marketplaces. And we heard a lot about that from the Honourable Member from Makerfield. And there has been concerns expressed about that across the floor in the debate today about the digital markets. And we know that our constituents share those concerns. This is all made worse by the fact that regulators don't have the necessary powers to hold companies to account when the law is flouted. The Competition and Markets Authority does what it can to uphold consumer law, but any of its investigations can take years and tend to result in commitments instead of fines, offering little in the way of deterrent for those who would flout the law. The problem is, in order to be more effective, it needs more powers at its disposal if it is to properly perform the task of protecting consumer rights. Now, I note with interest the conclusions of the Penrose Review, where it's proposed that the Competition and Market Authority should have increased powers, sharper teeth, to drive consumer rights, supply-side reforms and productivity improvements, with a streamlined legislative framework for UK competition consumer policy. Of greater interest is which of the Penrose conclusions will the UK Government take forward. Indeed, if the Penrose Review is implemented in full, it could constitute the biggest shake-up of the UK's competition and consumer law regime since the creation of the Competition and Markets Authority in 2014. From providing the Competition and Markets Authority with the same powers to prosecute consumer law cases that it has for competition law investigations, to reform sectoral regulations. It contains some very interesting ideas, giving the Competition and Markets Authority significantly increased powers. However, there are some concerns that have been expressed that concentrating such increased power in the Competition and Markets Authority at a time when it is in the process of adapting to its new post-Brexit caseload, as well as the challenges of a digitised economy, this could be very, very challenging for the Competition and Markets Authority indeed. But we simply don't know as yet what the Government response to the Penrose Review will be, although it does appear, and I underline the word appear, it does appear that the Chancellor and the Business Secretary has welcomed the recommendations. The question is, where do we go from here? We have all waited so long. The Chair of the Competition and Markets Authority, Lord Tyree, set out recommendations for reform in 2019. In 2020, the Honourable Member for Westminster-super-Mare was asked by the Government to look into competition and published his report last year. The UK Government recognised the need for reform to reform the enforcement regime in its 2019 manifesto, and the Department for Business and the Department for Digital and Culture have undertaken consultations. And last year, we saw the Business Secretary set out plans to bolster competition regimes. But this must be underpinned by legislation. Consumer and competition policy has been under review for over 4 years. And this has meant that challenges consumers face in the marketplace have continued and have often become much more difficult. If the Competition and Markets Authority had more and sufficient power to protect consumers and hold companies accountable under the law for breaking consumer law, which other regulators enjoy, we can raise standards in the consumer marketplace. And we can see clearly what the lack of such powers can lead to in practice. And we have the example about the secondary ticketing platform Viagogo for 6 years, with the threat of legal action to finally change its practices and pay attention to the Competition and Markets Authority guidance on advising consumers. Now, we know, I think, that had the imposition of immediate fines for not complying with guidance been an option, it would have not taken 6 years for Viagogo to comply and secure the changes that everybody wanted. And we've all seen that the Competition and Markets Authority lacked the power it needed to ensure that consumers were refunded money during COVID disruption from some players in the travel and the wedding sector within a reasonable time frame. A consumer and competition bill would be able to tackle bad business practices which harm consumers and consumer confidence with simpler investigation procedures and with fines able to be imposed without matters being dragged through the courts in lengthy processes, which the Honourable Member from Westminster-super-Mare said when he was on his feet. This would be nothing but a boon to consumer confidence and protection. Now, I agree with the points in the report calling for stronger protections for consumers against the so-called loyalty penalty, unfair contractual terms, perceived attempts by digital businesses to nudge consumers into making decisions or making it hard for them to exit contracts, and of course the practice of creating an unreal sense of urgency to pressurise consumers into making purchases as well as trapping them in subscriptions. A code of conduct to ensure the largest online platforms don't abuse their market power, and with an alternative dispute resolution scheme offering efficient and affordable and proportionate routes to resolve difficulties for high-value transactions without the complexity and cost of small claims courts will be of benefit for both business and consumers. Finally, we must reach a point where a consumer and competition bill is introduced in the upcoming programme for government. That must be the point where at last all the work that has been done comes to fruition and a competition and enforcement framework that's fit for the modern economy is delivered through legislation. There is real impatience now for the government to finally commit to real action on these important consumer protection matters. It is not clear how far the government will go in terms of improving competition and consumer policy. We don't know how it's going to interpret and implement the recommendations of the Penrose Review. Perhaps the Minister, when he gets to his feet today, will enlighten us on that. Despite the proposals made by the Chair of the Competition and Markets Authority, Lord Tyree, we have had consultations by the Department of Business and the Department for Culture. We've had the Penrose Review. What we have not yet had is the introduction of a Consumer and Competitions Bill. We all look forward to a bill with proper teeth, which will confer real power to the Competition and Markets Authority to support consumer confidence and a marketplace where the consumer is protected, where, as the Penrose Review boldly set out, the market works for people and not the other way around. I very much look forward to this long-promised, long-awaited, much-anticipated bill, and I hope the Minister today will, at least today, set out some kind of timescale when we'll be able to see it, scrutinise it and debate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Efford. It is indeed a pleasure to serve under your chairship today. And I do want to also extend my thanks and congratulations to the Honourable Member for Weston-super-Mare for initiating this debate, but also for his work on this issue and his very important report, Power to the People, that was published around a year ago. He also, in his opening remarks, I think very clearly laid out the sentiments and the recommendations of the report, but also a very important part of that, which is the context of declining competitiveness, the productivity challenge that we face, and also the importance of making sure that we can act against non-compliance of companies that don't play their part in ensuring that we have a fair regime for all businesses and for consumers. And he is right to raise those issues, and also around vested interests that distort our markets. And competition law seeks to curb practices that undermine or restrict competition to the detriment of consumers, Mr Efford. This can include the abuse of a dominant market position by a firm, anti-competitive practices, and mergers or takeovers, which, if allowed, would result in a substantial lessening of competition. And in the context of how we've seen a rapid increase in takeovers and mergers, particularly through and post some of the lockdown and the pandemic, I think this is an area that does need some further work, and I will also be coming back to. Now, at the time of the Penrose review, Labour welcomed the report, but we also highlighted where we thought it needed to go further. You know, UK markets are becoming more concentrated, they're hitting consumers and workers and stopping small businesses being able to progress, and stopping small businesses in their tracks as well. So we do want to see a revaluation of the role of the Competition and Markets Authority and ensuring that it has the tools to tackle the growing concentration of market power. Now, we may disagree on the rolling back of economic regulation. I don't think that's necessarily the case in principle, but it's more about saying, do we have the regulations that we need for the effective regulation of markets for consumers? And that may or may not be quantity, but I think it is about quality, and that's, I think, where we need to start the debate. And I'm not a person who's interested in regulation for regulation's sake. For me, it's about purpose, and it's about making sure that it's going to be effective and deliver the outcomes that we believe are necessary. Because we do need more robust competition policy, including action to crack down on tax avoidance as well and challenge mergers and acquisitions that might take on unsustainable debt or that aren't in Britain's long-term strategic interests. Now, Mr Efford, we've also had some very important contributions from honourable members today, and I do want to thank all honourable members. I think have made very distinct contributions and highlighted different areas of the debate today. My honourable friend, the member for Macclesfield, her work on consumer protection is long known in this House, and she raised some very important issues around fake reviews, which is all part of how consumers are informed. And if they are misinformed, how can action be taken to address that? But she also raised an important point about the common interest between consumers and businesses on making sure that markets work effectively and fairly. And she also, I think, highlighted or intimated about the importance of reform based on how consumers behave today and how the market is working, how consumers are receiving their goods and their services. Many of these issues are also interconnected as well. So I think she also rightly alluded to the work of which is very, very important in this area, and I want to thank them also for the contributions that they have made. Now, the Honourable Member for Truro and Falmouth, I think, highlighted and shared a very rich picture of her constituency, but also the opportunities and sectoral issues in her local economy, but the challenges that they're facing in terms of being able to take forward some of those opportunities. The Honourable Member as well for Folkestone and Hythe, I think highlighted so very clearly the issues around the dominance of power of social media companies as well, which I think is an important backdrop for some of the areas that we're talking about in terms of digital markets reform as well. And the Honourable Member for North Ayrshire and Arran, I think to start out talking about the importance of value for money and consumer protection and some of the issues that she raised, I think very similar to the Honourable Member for my Honourable friend, the Honourable Member for Macclesfield, were very powerful. And focusing on consumers' interests has never been more important, Mr Efford, with the cost of living crisis that consumers are facing. Inflation is out of control, with energy, food and petrol prices also rocketing. And this isn't just about global factors. We know that poor government economic management has also left us uniquely exposed. And we have a buy now, pay later loan scheme for energy bills, rather than dealing with the problems in our energy market. We are also now very worried about raising taxes on working people and businesses at the worst possible time. Indeed, in parallel to the debate we're having today, is the Opposition Day debate calling on the government again to stop the national insurance rise coming in April. But look, on this long journey of reform, Mr Efford, you will be aware that when Labour was in power, we argued very strongly about UK regulation of anti-competitive practices being weak, which led to one of our first pieces of legislation being the Competition Act in 1998. But the recent journey as well is worth noting. The Honourable Member raised this because it's been 4 years since the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy asked the CMA to come forward with proposals to better protect consumers in the digital economy and improve public trust in markets. And indeed, the then CMA Chairman, Lord Tyree, outlined his proposals to the Secretary of State in the letter in 2019. The Penrose Review followed in February 2021. And last summer, the government published 2 consultation documents, the first on reforming competition and consumer policy, and the second on a pro-competition regime for digital markets. Now, both sets of proposals would require legislation in terms of how we may take forward some of the challenges raised. But the government has yet to respond or publish its response to either of these consultations. Now, what I do recognise is that both the Penrose Review and the government's consultations represent some progress in terms of addressing the rules currently governing the UK's companies and markets, and not least as they serve as in that they also serve as a recognition that reform is necessary. They are even more so as vehicles for reform to the UK antitrust regime post-COVID and post-Brexit. And I do think that the Penrose Review is very important as well in this respect. The existing system, however, is no longer serving consumers appropriately and is not fit for purpose in the digital age, which could lead also to new monopolies being created at any time in new markets as well. Now, the broad consensus seems to... I will take the intervention.
Thank you for giving way. I just wanted to clarify. It sounds as though, but I just want to sort of get this on the record, it sounds as though that she is joining other members in this debate in saying that we do now need a new Competition and Consumer Act in order to fix some of these things. Can she just confirm that is the Labour Party's position? I think that's what she's saying, but I don't want to put words in her mouth.
Well, I am coming on to say that, but I do think that we need legislation on this, and I think we would hope that it will be coming forward and announced in the next Queen's speech. And I will certainly be coming back onto that in my closing remarks. Now, the broad consensus I was saying is that this seems to be of providing the regulators, and in this case as well, the CMA and the CAT as well, with more powers in order to protect consumers and hold companies accountable if they are not found to be playing by the rules. I think this is a very positive step. But so far, I say this gently, I do believe that both the Penrose Review and the government's consultations are a missed opportunity for a more fundamental review and reform of the UK marketplace. And even the CMA, which is now responsible for all anti-competitive practices that affect UK markets and consumers, has commented that suggestions in the consultation, government's consultation on reforming competition and consumer policy amounted to incremental reform as opposed to radical change to the competition regime. And let me just make mention as well of resources to make any regime effective, because this was also an issue very clearly raised in the debate yesterday, Mr. Efford, on economic crime, that powers and resources for investigation and enforcement are absolutely critical. They are the other side of the coin to policy. It is about how we make sure that any regime can be effectively implemented. So in my remaining limited remarks, I want to just focus on 4 areas briefly for the Minister to perhaps respond to in his remarks. And they do reflect in large part some of the areas that have been commented on, but 1 or 2 extras as well. Now, first on digital competition and regulation. Digital is changing our economy. It's changing how our economy works. It's changing the products that we have. It's changing the way we receive services, how consumers purchase those services, how businesses trade as well with each other. But there is a huge concentration of power of the big digital firms, with consequences for monopolisation, consumer rights, consumer prices, and indeed, as well as, I think this important point that has been raised as well, access to markets for new firms. And tackling this also, we know, needs international cooperation. Now, the government has embarked on the creation of the Digital Markets Unit in the CMA to set up on a non-statutory basis last April, I believe. But I do hope that we are going to hear when it will be moved onto a statutory footing and with the teeth that it will need. So will bills on competition and consumer law reform and on digital markets be in the Queen's speech? And perhaps the Minister can share with this House. We will take it no further. It will be between these 4 walls that whether that legislation will be coming forward in the Queen's speech. Now, secondly, on powers for the CMA and the speeding up of investigations. I do believe that the Penrose Review also made a recommendation for a task force for how we can make sure that investigations by the CMA can be more effective. And this is important to get justice for consumers, as he has also talked about. And what more is the government planning to do in this area? You know, there are other instances of unfairness and I think questionable policy. If I highlight one example that really struck me before Christmas, the Royal Mail highlighting that there were 23 areas that pre-Christmas were going to see a reduction in services. But this came on the back of £400 million in dividends being paid out, being announced the month before. And it doesn't seem to be right that you don't have some accountability for some of that decision-making and how it's being made. But also, I do think there's some positive news and progress, because I do believe the CMA, in their own response to the Penrose Review, announced that they're creating a dedicated microeconomic unit that he called for, which I understand they'll be basing in Darlington at the Treasury campus. Thirdly, on the public interest test, Mr Efford, Labour has proposed the introduction of a broad public interest test for mergers and acquisitions. This would give the government powers to review transactions, impose conditions and block transactions where they could have a negative long-term implications for the UK's industrial strategy, economy and jobs. The government has powers under the Enterprise Act 2002 to intervene in mergers and acquisitions where they raise issues of national security, stability of the UK financial system, media plurality, or maintaining in the UK ability to combat and mitigate effects of public health emergencies. Now, we are calling for the Enterprise Act to be expanded to include a public interest test where there may be long-term implications in an acquisition for the UK's industrial strategy. In our view, this goes further than the Penrose Review and strengthening of interests of consumers. And we do believe we need a debate on how the CMA should move past narrow competition and consumer interest to public interest. On takeovers and mergers, this could apply to consumer interest, but also to the impact on supply chains, employees, and the public interest more generally that has then implications for consumer interests. And we do also need the CMA, consistent with the approach that he will know that we've taken on the subsidy control bill, to have more diverse voices in its leadership, including reforms to the authority to make it more representative of the nations and regions of the UK. And finally, just to comment on hollowed-out local enforcement. Our consumer protection regime is weakened by 10 years of degradation of local authority trading standards teams. And it is a serious issue. The number of LATS officers has been cut by over 50% since 2010. 45% of local authority trading standards teams say they do not have the resources to deal with consumer issues in their area. I note the Penrose Reviews has called for action on this, and I would be grateful for the Minister's confirmation that some of these announcements will form part of his package of reforms coming this year. Now, finally, in conclusion, the Labour welcomes competition and consumer choice in the UK as a sign of a healthy, functioning market economy. We are committed to making the UK the best place to start and grow business in the world. And we believe that this is important as part of a pro-business, pro-society, pro-worker agenda to be built for Britain. We are ready and waiting for Parliament to have the opportunity to act and to build on the progress in the Penrose Review. We believe the government has been a little too slow. So I do hope the Minister will give us confidence that things will be speeded up, and I look forward to working with him and with colleagues across the House on the important agenda as it moves forward. Thank you.
Thank you much. It's very much a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Efford, and can I congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Westminster-super-Mare, for securing today's debate and indeed his report. I think Wolfie Smith will be turning his Afghan coat when he sees that power to the people has become the mantra of fixing broken markets to encourage good competition and free markets. But it's really, the report is an interesting, by the way, you see the tumbleweed for some of the younger members of this place as well, for that reference that I'm hoping my honourable friend remembers. The report itself is an important contribution to the debates on reforming the UK's competition policy. His report has had a significant role in shaping the government's thinking on the priorities for reform, and I reiterate my thanks for his work and his continued engagement and advocacy for reform. In his report, my honourable friend argued that the UK's competition and consumer regime should be one of the best in the world, and the government's absolutely full square behind that objective. Now the UK has left the EU, we must build on this country's innovative foundations to create a robust and agile economy that works for everyone and that is fit for future generations. Now, competition and consumer policy have a central role in creating a thriving free market economy that encourages innovation, enterprise growth and productivity. Competition policy is crucial in creating the right conditions for healthy competition between traders in markets to win over consumers by offering the best deals and innovation. And consumer policy is vital in underpinning consumer confidence. It empowers consumers to engage in markets in an assured manner, knowing that they have a strong set of legal rights that will be respected and enforced. And that's why we committed in our manifesto to give the CMA enhanced powers to tackle consumer rip-offs and bad business practices. And it's also why the government committed in its plan for growth to the UK to having a best-in-class competition regime, which will raise innovation and investment across the economy. An effective competition and consumer policy will help us build back a better and fairer economy, giving businesses confidence that they're competing on fair terms and the public confidence that they're getting a good deal. The UK's competition regime is already internationally well regarded, and so we're starting from a strong foundation, but we should always strive to be better and go further. Markets and the way consumers and businesses engage with each other has changed dramatically since our current legislation was enacted. And that's particularly stark in the digital economy. The tech revolution has brought huge benefits. Recent research has shown that around 15% of all businesses have adopted at least one AI technology. But in recent years, we've also seen that some digital markets have certain characteristics which make them more prone to weak competition. Despite the actions that the UK has taken to promote competition, there's evidence from the CMA that competition may have weakened over the last 20 years. In 2020, the government commissioned the CMA to produce an expert state of competition assessment to improve our collective understanding on the level and nature of competition across the UK economy. So in its first state of competition in the UK, the CMA found that markups, a ratio of prices to costs, had increased 7% from 2000 to 2018. It found that in 2018, the average combined market share of the 10 largest firms in an industry was 3% higher than in 1998. And so it's essential that competition regime does more to encourage and maintain competitive markets. And so the government published 2 consultations on legislative reforms in July last year, building on my honourable friend's work. The consultation Reforming Competition and Consumer Policy set out a vision for the future of our competition and consumer policy. The separate consultation, A New Pro-Competition Regime for Digital Markets, sets out the vision for a new agile and flexible regime to promote competition in digital markets, as both he and my honourable friend, the member for Folkestone, highlighted where we need to improve. So those package of reforms contained in the government's 2 consultations share the ambitions of my honourable friend's report. And those proposals seek to enhance the powers of the CMA, enhance consumers' rights, and ensure those rights are robustly enforced. They will work to protect consumers and help businesses thrive. And in addition to sharing those ambitions, his detailed report has had a considerable influence on where government sees opportunities for reform. One of the central recommendations, as indeed, just quickly.
Can you just clarify when the government expects to respond to the couple of consultations you just mentioned? Because clearly they will inform what might or might not be in any future Competition and Consumer Act.
Indeed, and he's right to actually have the anniversary, the near anniversary of his report as an opportunity to discuss this. Unfortunately, he's just slightly missed the target of the consultation response, which we're hoping to bring forward very, very, very shortly. And indeed, whereas the Penrose, to answer Honourable Lady's point, the Penrose report didn't need Her Majesty to give the notification that it was coming forward. Unfortunately, I can't preempt Her Majesty what she will say in the Queen's speech as to future legislation. But one of the central recommendations of my honourable friend's report, and he's repeated it again today, that the government should take steps to ensure the enforcement of a competition and consumer law keeps pace with that modern digitising economy. It speeds up, and we absolutely agree. And so we proposed a range of measures to make enforcement more efficient. For instance, we've proposed that the CMA should have stronger powers to penalise businesses which obstruct or slow down investigation, and has proposed new ways for businesses and the CMA to reach agreements on the actions needed to resolve competition issues in market-wide investigations and merger reviews. And both those changes were recommended by my honourable friend in his report. He also recognised the need for UK competition regulators to work in partnership with regulators overseas to help address competition and consumer issues which span borders. And we agree that effective international cooperation is a really important part of the UK's competition and consumer regime. Promoting that cooperation is a key objective in our free trade agreements, and we've successfully secured text on this in the UK's recent agreements with Australia and New Zealand. And we've consulted on legislative proposals to ensure that the CMA and consumer authorities can work as effectively as possible with their international counterparts. My honourable friend's report also emphasised the role of consumer protection law in empowering consumers and driving effective competition. We agree that our already strong consumer rights framework must continue to support consumers into the future, allowing them to benefit from new technology and new business models and feel empowered to make the best decisions available to them. And so we've consulted on measures to tackle subscription traps, where a consumer enters into a subscription for a product or service but has difficulty leaving, and also consulted on measures to tackle fake reviews, as mentioned by the Honourable Lady from the Member for Makerfield, which undermines competition and gives that unfair advantage, as she described, to traders that are willing to use them. And in taking steps to strengthen the protections for consumers, the government's absolutely aware of the need to consider any new burdens on businesses. We want to ensure that consumers get that fair deal whilst business is not overburdened by regulatory barriers. He's absolutely right to talk about better regulation, and I'll maybe speak a little bit more about that in a second if I have time. But he talked about, and it was mentioned about how we can have better dispute resolution. Because when consumers enforce their rights, poorly performing firms face more pressure, and consumers know they can trust the system to be on their side if they need it. That's what we need. Yes.
Thank you for giving way again. It's been very generous. I just wanted to press a little bit on this point about better regulation. I think that he's not so far said that he's minded to go back to 1 in, 1 out, or 1 in, 2 out. Could he just clarify for us what mechanism the government has to actually ensure that better regulation happens, as opposed to being wished for with a target which won't be hit?
Yeah, look, I think we consulted on reforming the better regulation framework, and the government doesn't think that a 1 in, 2, 3, whatever number out rule is consistent with delivering world-class regulation to support the economy and adapting to a new wave of the technological revolution, or indeed achieving net zero. So we want to reduce costs to business wherever we sensibly can, and only regulate where strictly necessary. And we intend to do that by looking at the merits of each case rather than using the 1 in, 2 out system. And we plan to change the better regulation system so it will do that. But indeed, as I say, it's very important that we get this balance right. But the government believes that a well-functioning alternative dispute resolution, ADR, that can make markets work more effectively, increase consumer confidence in spending, and generate higher trade compliance with the law. It's a really important avenue to redress for consumers that more easily allows for mediated settlements and is less confrontational than the court process, which is often more costly and time-intensive. And so we sought views and proposals to enhance ADR in resolving consumer disputes. He also recommended about the CMA's consumer enforcement powers should be upgraded, and that would allow it to decide cases itself and impose fines in the same way that it does for civil enforcement of competition law. And again, we sought views on empowering the CMA to enforce consumer law directly. And we consulted on giving the Competition and Market Authority new powers to decide itself whether consumer law has been broken. And under this proposal, the CMA could directly impose directions, remedies, or monetary penalties on firms who mistreat their customers without having to go through the courts, as is currently the case. That will allow the CMA to intervene earlier and further. He also mentioned about the CAT, and I have to say, although there are plenty more things I'm sure the CAT can do, there have been changes actually brought on by COVID, and it's the learning of COVID. I visited their virtual court the other day, where they heard the case of Newcastle United's takeover by the Saudi buyers. They had 35,000 people tuning in, which is more people than all but the top 9 of the Premier League's average gate. And so there are a lot of Geordies and Newcastle fans elsewhere who are now experts on competition law, which is I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but nonetheless, it really does shine the light, being the transparencies up, on the work of the CAT and indeed the competition regime. But there are clearly challenges of some markets in the digital economy as well, and Honourable Member for Folkestone talked about that, and that's why we've looked in the digital consultation about what we can do in terms of having a bespoke regime in many ways, because it's important. Government is not particularly, frankly, very good at keeping up with technology as a whole. I mean, we're talking about government as an overall body rather than any particular government. And so it's right that the market looks at how it can introduce, we can introduce conduct requirements, how we can have pro-competitive interventions by the digital market unit to keep up with an ever-changing regime. And we also did consult on a merger regime to exactly the point that he was talking about, the so-called killer acquisitions and other stifling of innovation. I remember the days with Netscape, Mozilla, Firefox, all of these other browsers that were available that have fallen by the wayside. Again, tumbleweed by my colleague behind me, who's far younger. But the Honourable Lady Futuro talked about Cornwall, and actually what she did, she didn't just talk about regulation and competition regimes and legislation to promote things like the direct sales of fish and the secondary industries around the exciting opportunities that surround lithium. It's about actually promoting that enterprise, that innovation in itself. And if regulation is there, that's fantastic, but it doesn't always need to resort back to a regime, a constructed regime around it, if there are businesses ready to grab opportunities. And so this needs to be part of a suite of measures that we to ensure that the UK is the best place to start to grow and scale a business. And part of that is the strategies that we're coming out with BEIS to show that we are ready and we are investing for the long term and supporting for the long term those kind of technologies that will give businesses the confidence to invest in areas such as Truro and Falmouth in order to be able to really make the most of that. I'm just trying to look at some of the other areas. And the Honourable Lady from Makerfield talked about weddings, and I have to say this was an interesting point in COVID, because I think it shows the difficulty that you have in terms of having a consumer policy, because whereas absolutely brides and I was the minister charged to engage with the wedding sector, and that was quite a challenge, because you've got brides and grooms looking forward to their special day, and it costs a lot of money. And the whole point about the wedding sector is it builds up anticipation and expectation. But clearly, especially those venues and organisers had a lot of money and they had a lot of reservations. They have a single day to provide that service, and when they were compelled to lock down or the demand was stifled, if they had refunded everything in one go, they would have been out of business. And so there's a hugely difficult balance, and there was a lot of arguments between them and the CMA within that. But I'm glad that we've got through that largely, that we were able to navigate through that with working with the CVA, with the CMA and the sector to be able to progress. Now, just to conclude, my honourable friend's report, because I want to give him time to respond. He's represented a significant milestone in, with this report in process of reforming competition and consumer policy. I reiterate my thanks for his work, and I know we're going to continue the conversation as we bring legislation to bear, as we make these changes where primary legislation is required, despite the fact there are already changes happening now. And I hope he's acknowledged that there's been direct impact on the proposals which we've consulted. So we'll bring that together. I continue to work with stakeholders. I've just been speaking to stakeholders just last week on this very subject, and we're carefully considering the feedback, and we will come back with measures in good time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Efford, and thank you to everybody for their contributions during the course of this debate. The one thing which has been very, very clear, Mr. Efford, is that everybody here wants us to go further and faster. Everyone's saying, get on with it. Why aren't we moving more quickly? It's the only time in my life I think I've ever been outflanked on a competition issue by the Labour front bench. I think I'm sort of paraphrasing here, but saying they agree with a great deal that's in the report, but they'd like a few areas where it should go further in their view. Even without that, I think that the clear message from everybody who's spoken today is we agree with most of this, and we want it to happen quickly, please, and to go further. I think is radicalism, not incrementalism, has been the message universally. So I think that my honourable friend, the Minister, can take away a reassuring message that perhaps, contrary to what he might have expected, there is a cross-party agreement for more competition and more consumer rights and because from that comes a better and more trusting economy, and therefore a more productive economy, and therefore a more high-wage economy too. I wasn't sure that I was going to get that when I stood up at the start of this debate, but it has been very, very clear that that is where we are. I would, however, mention to him that we will need to push him a little bit, because there are a couple of things that he didn't mention in his remarks. He didn't mention the stuff about whether or not we can further reform some of the economically regulated sectors to normalise as much of them as we can in order to make sure that we don't need extra protections because the existing consumer protections will be enough. He didn't have a chance. It looks like he might have had a section of his speech he didn't get to. That will be lovely if he can then commit to that when we get to the primary legislation. He's also very clear that there will be primary legislation. He can't give too many details, I appreciate, in advance of the Queen's speech, but it is clear that you can't have the Digital Markets Unit functioning effectively without primary legislation, and so therefore more progress will be needed. And I'm afraid that while he was very, very clear about the shortcomings as he sees them, in the one-in, one-out or one-in, two-out mechanism for better regulation, and the fact that he has a mechanism, he thinks, for an alternative approach which will work. When I asked him about how, we just got a repetition about what rather than how, and there wasn't any detail behind that. I'm sure that he has it, but I'm also hoping, I'm sure that he will come round to describing it in detail in public very shortly, because at the moment it's a bit of a mystery, and without it we will have nothing that works. But other than that, Mr. Everett, I thank everybody again. I thank the Minister for his comments. I think we're making progress. We've got an awfully long way still to travel.